Afternoon. The Community Senior Center of Richmond, Huntington, and Bolton is pleased to host Tim Weed, who will be presenting A Playground for Empire, Historical Perspectives on Cuba and the USA. This presentation is sponsored by Vermont Humanities through its Speakers Bureau program. In addition to providing public talks, Vermont Humanities sponsors book discussion programs, a wide array of literacy programs, and other humanities events statewide. Tim Weed is a Vermont-based writer and educator living in Putney. He's the co-founder of the Cuba Writers Program and a member of the core faculty of the Newport MFA in Creative Writing. Tim's history of education and travel in Cuba began in the late 1990s, when he brought some of the first American students to the country since the revolution. Since then, he's led dozens of trips to Cuba, including museum programs, concert tours, creative writing workshops, and writing residencies for the Newport MFA. Tim's new novel, The Afterlife Project, a finalist for the PRISM Prize in Climate Literature, will be published on June 3rd of this year. This program is going to be recorded, so after Tim's talk, there'll be time for questions. Please wait to receive a microphone before asking your questions so that they'll be heard on the recording. And finally, please silence your cell phones so there's no interruptions. So without further ado, please give Tim Weed a warm welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? And thank you for inviting me here. It's wonderful to be in this beautiful community. I've never been here. Just before I get started, just a quick question. How many of you have been to Cuba? Okay, great. Okay, and how many are sort of interested in possibly going? Okay, great. Again, good. Okay, just that helps me know where we are. Okay, so what I'm going to do is talk for maybe 45, 50 minutes, giving you this historical perspective, and then we'll throw it open for questions and discussions. As Catherine mentioned, I've been going to Cuba since 1999, usually multiple times a year. The last time I was there was not this year, but last March. So it's an interesting perspective. I do travel there fairly frequently. I have in addition to what Catherine mentioned, I'm a writer, a novelist, and also an instructor, a teacher of writing. But I also have a business. I have a company that does trips to Cuba. So I've done lots of cultural trips and things like that, but I also set up trips for small groups. So I actually feel okay mentioning that, even though it is a little bit of a self-promotion, because one of the things that Cubans need more than anything else right now is visitors. We'll talk about this as we get into the contemporary situation, but their economy is not good right now, and one of their main sources of income are visitors. So it's really a win-win if you do go to Cuba. It's a win for you because you get to experience the inspiring and interesting situation in Cuba, but it's also a win for the Cuban people. So I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about that. So it's Cuba. The island of Cuba is about roughly the same square mileage as the state of Florida, but it feels a lot bigger. And that's because you have all of these mountain ranges, really a big one here, the Sierra Maestra, another one, the Sierra Cristal, and various mountain ranges. So that and also because the roads, for most of the island, the roads are very bad. I once took a bus from Santiago down in the south over to Havana up in the north, and it was about 15 and a half hours. So that's just to give you a perspective, a sense of the geography. It's a very interesting country, but I'm gonna really sort of, I went to Middlebury College years ago, and I used to have a professor there named Pardon Tillinghast. If anyone is familiar with Middlebury, you might remember Pardon, who was a wonderful, wonderful professor, but the rap on Pardon was, if you drop your pencil, you'll miss 2 centuries. Because he spoke really fast. And I'm gonna try and do that a little bit because there's a lot of ground to cover, and what I wanna do here is offer a bit of a survey of the history of Cuba, and particularly the history of Cuba with relation to the United States and other empires that have sort of fought over it over the years. And I will also say that I think that the perspective that I aim to offer is a perspective of my Cuban friends, the people who still live on the island, which may be a little different than those of us who grew up in the United States have heard with regard to Cuba, okay? So, 1492 was the fall of the last Moorish strongholds in Spain. This was the end of the 700-year Moorish domination of the Iberian Peninsula, and it was the consolidation of the homeland for what would become the biggest global empire in the history of the world up to that point. That was the Spanish Empire. And so in the same year, 1492, Columbus sailed in search of a passage to the Indies, and he didn't find what he was expecting, but he did claim 2 new islands for the Spanish king and queen, Hispaniola and Cuba. And the 2 islands were the first outposts of Spanish America. They became a critical resource for Spain in the centuries to come, and Cuba was an especially rich and beautiful island. It became known as La Perla de las Antillas, the Pearl of the Antilles, in part because it was just so beautiful and rich. This coincided, of course, with the brutal conquest and slaughter of the original inhabitants, the Arawak Indians. Sort of an apocryphal story. There was one powerful chief or cacique named Hatue, which used to be a famous beer in Cuba, and the Spanish captured him and tied him to a stake to burn him, and a Franciscan friar who was present told him about the God of the Christians and the articles of religious faith. And he was told that he would burn in the internal fires of hell if he didn't convert, but if he did, he would be forgiven and go to heaven. And he asked, do all Christians go to heaven? And the friar said, yes, they do. And he said, then I would prefer to go to hell. So it was a kind of it's a funny apocryphal story, but it's kind of indicative of how incredibly brutal it was of a conquest. So the Spanish first settled Cuba in 1512. There were seven settlements or villas at the time, including 4 that are getting a lot of attention from tourists these days, or Santiago, Baracoa, Trinidad, and then Havana itself were 4 of the original settlements. And Havana came to dominate the western half of the island. It was the point of contact, importantly, for all the Gulf Stream traffic between Spain and the New World. Starting in the 1560s, Havana became the official transit station for the treasure fleets that were taking gold from, Mexico and overland from Peru. Gold and silver would all congregate here in Havana, and then the fleets would assemble in Havana and then go up, follow the coast here, and then catch the Gulf Stream back across the Atlantic Ocean to the port of Cadiz or Sevilla, because there was power in numbers. And all of this Spanish gold and silver that was going to be shipped, from Havana to Spain, was kept in this building. It's the Castillo de la Real Fuerza. It was kept under heavy guard until the next treasure fleet was ready to sail. This is one of the oldest buildings in the Caribbean, and if you're in Havana, you can't miss it. It's right there in the center of the Plaza de Armas. Back in 1494, as part of the Treaty of Tordesillas, Pope Alexander VI had drawn a line from the north to the South Pole, 360 leagues west of the Azores, and giving Portugal all the lands to the east and Spain all the lands to the west. So you can see how that worked. You can see very clearly in the way that the world is shaped today. It was a major development. But the other European powers, as you can imagine, were not pleased about this division. Francis I of France said, Show me the clause in Adam's will which gives the king of Spain dominion over half the world. And Elizabeth I of England took it further. She said, since the sea belongs to everyone, it belongs to me. And so this was the beginning of the age of privateers. She actually encouraged the most adventurous and bold English captains to confront the Spanish at sea, and thus created a whole new class of privateers, which led to this sort of age of piracy. And one of the reasons that Havana was selected as the capital was because of its defensibility against pirates. In the 1660s and 1670s, the Spanish built a wall around the entire old city. You can see the wall here, and to protect it from pirate raids. And they also they built this castle. It didn't have the lighthouse at the time, but this castle is right at the edge of the harbor. And this is called the Castillo de los Tres Reyes del Morro, or simply El Morro, which is a beautiful piece of architecture. It's sort of, if you visit, you can't, another thing that if you're here in Havana, you can't miss it. It almost looks like it grows up out of the peninsula where it's built, because the rock to build it was made from the same, it was sort of harvested or quarried in the same place. So it's a beautiful piece of architecture. It considered one of the great architectural achievements of the Caribbean in the colonial period. But back to the age of piracy, what they would do is, so this stands at the mouth of the harbor, and this is the other mouth, and they would string a line of barrels on a chain called a boom chain across to block off the mouth of the harbor, so the pirates couldn't get in, and the wall would protect the cities. And then every night at 9, they would fire a cannon to warn the citizens. And those of you who've been to Havana may have been, has anybody been to the Cañonazo? Cañonazo is a ceremony that takes place every night at 9 p.m. to this day, where they fire off the cannon. So if anywhere in Havana you can hear this cannon shot, and it's celebrating the fact that this is what we're saying, okay, we're closing all the gates. So anyway, by the early 18th century, commercial ties were beginning to be made between Cuba and the United States, and particularly the US Gulf Coast. And this was extending Cuba's trade reach all the way up the Mississippi River into the agricultural the regions of at the beginning, the sort of nascent agricultural regions of the Midwest. But legally speaking, this was all smuggling, because Spain had a complete trade monopoly over Cuba. No one else was allowed to trade with them. But then in the spring of 1762, during the culmination of the 7 Years' War, the English assembled one of the largest war fleets ever seen, with 28,000 soldiers and sailors, and they headed for Havana. And the Spanish, they had this fortress. So what they did is they closed the boom chain. You can see the boom chain here, to block off the English fleet from coming in. And that sounds good. The only problem is that the entire Spanish Navy was stuck in the harbor. So the English had complete freedom to sail up and down the coast, bombarding Havana. And the British, laid siege to the city. They pounded the forts with artillery, and then eventually, when the city was weak enough, they walked in from the east, took the hill overlooking the city, and took both the city and the Morro fortress. And the Spanish eventually surrendered, and the British entered Havana. This is 1762, and so the British in 1762 captured the most important harbor in the Spanish West Indies and a large portion of the Spanish Navy. This was a huge blow to the prestige of the Spanish Empire. It showed how fragile it was, and probably was, a really important marker in the sort of the beginning of the end of the Spanish Empire. The English occupied the city of Havana for 10 months. They might have stayed longer, but they were devastated by malaria and yellow fever. Spain got Havana back with the Treaty of Paris in 1763, but what did they have to give up in exchange? Florida. So that's how Florida came into British hands. And the Cubans joke, yes, and so we gave it to you in 1762, but now we're getting it back, right? Because there's so many Cuban immigrants going to Florida. But the important thing historically is just to notice that the British occupation represented an extremely important break in that Spanish trade monopoly. And for the first time, Cuba could resume or pursue open commerce with the United States. And this marked an important period in the historical development of Cuba because it evolved from a service colony, for the Spanish Empire, into the world's premier source of one product, sugar. Sugar was a huge moneymaker, and in the early part of the 19th century, it drove a period of great prosperity. And the prosperity resulted in large part from the new sugar trade with the United States. Many of the cobblestones that you see in Old Havana and in Trinidad, another old city, are ballast stones from Massachusetts and Rhode Island, from ships coming down participating in the triangle trade. And so by the late 18th century, Cuba had become the richest colony in the world. So just one more thing about sugar is the world was addicted to sugar, and this addiction grew worse. And the only way to get sugar at that time was through sugar cane. It was before the sugar beet. And so if you are a country or a colony with the premier access to the one product the world is addicted to, things are going to go well economically. So rewind to 1809. President Thomas Jefferson sent a general to Spain in an attempt to purchase Cuba. Jefferson wrote, and it was unsuccessful, Jefferson wrote, "I candidly confess that I have ever looked upon Cuba as the most interesting addition that can be made to our present system of states. With Cuba and Canada," he wrote, "we should have such an empire for liberty as she has never surveyed since the creation." And this was the beginning of a trend in the U.S. attitude toward Cuba that we'll come back to again and again. And to understand the relationship, we have to go back a few years to the Louisiana Purchase by Thomas Jefferson in 1803. The Louisiana Purchase did a lot of things that was incredibly important for the development of this, young United States. But one of the things that made it most valuable was this river structure that would allow these Midwestern farmers to ship their produce in barges down the Mississippi River to New Orleans, and then the grain would be transferred to ocean-going vehicles and shipped to Europe. So this was an essentially, important trade sort of dynamic for the United States. And in order for this to work, the United States needed to maintain strategic control of the Gulf of Mexico, not the Gulf of America, the Gulf of Mexico, and the exits into so you can see, here's the Gulf of Mexico, and the exits into the Caribbean and the Atlantic go right by Cuba. So strategically, it's a key location. In 1823, U.S. Secretary of State John Quincy Adams wrote, "These islands, Cuba and Puerto Rico, are natural appendages of the North American continent, and one of them, Cuba, almost within sight of our shores, from a multitude of considerations, has become an object of transcendent importance to the commercial and political interests of our Union." Later, as president, John Quincy Adams predicted that Cuba would fall like a ripening plum into the lap of the Union. And Cubans call this policy la fruta madura, the policy of the ripe fruit policy. But it didn't come to pass as easily as Adams had made it sound. So again, Cuba was a center of the transatlantic sugar trade. It was extremely lucrative for Spain, which may have been in part of what kept Cuba from joining the other Latin American independence movements that were happening in the 1820s. By 1825, the worldwide Spanish Empire had dwindled down to Cuba and a few other scattered colonies around the world, and Cuba was by far the richest part of that empire. It was the richest colony. There was no way the Spanish were going to let it go without a fight. But the United States was definitely interested. The U.S. ambassador to Spain commented to his British counterpart that Cuban sugar, quote, is as important to our people as are the wheat and cotton of India to Egypt and Great Britain. The wheat and cotton of India and Egypt to Great Britain. So what were India and Egypt to Great Britain? They were colonies. So wasn't it only natural for some in the U.S. to contemplate the prospect of Cuba as an American colony? In the early 1890s, Cuban writer and intellectual Jose Marti was in exile in the United States, trying to convince Cubans living abroad to join a new struggle for Cuban independence. to get a feel for what Jose, and those of you who have been to Cuba will know this already, but to get a feel for what Jose Marti means to Cuban people, think of Abraham Lincoln, Ralph Waldo Emerson, George Washington, and Walt Whitman, all rolled into one, because he was a poet, he was an intellectual, and he was a leader who organized these forces of independence and returned to Cuba in 1895 to fight on the front lines. He was also a martyr. He was killed in his first skirmish with the Spanish in May of 1895. So this new war for independence in Cuba was something that most Americans could support. The Spanish Empire had a bad reputation, and the Spanish response to the Cuban nationalists, the Cuban uprising of this revolution, was brutal. There was a general, famous Spanish general named Valeriano Weyler, who was slaughtering the Cuban insurrectionists to make a point. And he was the inventor of concentration camps, mass firing squads, assassinations, really horrible stuff. And President McKinley didn't want the war. He had been a major on the Union side in the Civil War, and he'd experienced the horrors of war firsthand. "I have been through one war," he said. "I have seen the dead piled up, and I do not want to see another." So for a long time, official U.S. policy toward Cuba was supporting the status quo, which meant preserving Spanish rule. Others disagreed. Soon after his inauguration in 1897, McKinley had appointed 39-year-old Theodore Roosevelt to be his Assistant Secretary of the Navy. TR was many things, but the aspect of his personality that's most relevant to Cuba is that he was unapologetically pro-war. He had some ideas that were quite common among men of his class and upbringing in 19th century America, but seem quite strange to us now. For example, like many educated men of his time, he believed strongly in the concept of manhood. He believed that war and manhood were closely related, and that war was the only field in which a country could find its greatness. "If I had my way," he wrote in 1897 about the idea of getting Spain out of Cuba, "that would be done tomorrow." And Teddy Roosevelt had a great deal of energy and charisma, and he was quickly becoming one of the most influential men in Washington, and his top priority in 1897 was going to war with Spain over Cuba. As a result of Roosevelt's influence, on January 25th, 1898, the U.S. warship Maine dropped anchor in Havana Bay, right under the noses of Cuba's Spanish rulers. "You might as well send a lighted candle on a visit to an open cask of gunpowder," said Mrs. Wainwright, who was the wife of the cruiser's captain. And on February 15th, 1898, the Maine exploded and sank. 250 American sailors were killed. The Navy announced it had been torpedoed or mined by the Spanish, though an investigation conducted much later in the 1970s revealed that it was actually an accidental explosion in the coal-fired engine. But that didn't matter. This was the era of yellow journalism. William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal and Joseph Pulitzer's New York World competed to fire the flames of war, and now public opinion had swung strongly to their side. "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." That was the popular chant. Roosevelt quit his job as Assistant Navy Secretary and helped to form the 1st Volunteer Cavalry, also known as the Rough Riders. And in the summer of 1898, the U.S. troops landed near Daiquiri, actually in Spanish, Daiquiri, near Guantanamo, 50 miles east of Santiago, joining the Cuban rebel army. That was the first, Daiquiri was the first drink to emerge from this war. The war culminated with an assault on the fortified village of El Caney and the storming of San Juan Hill, which overlooked the key city of Santiago. Teddy Roosevelt led the charge, and the Rough Riders did suffer some of the heaviest losses in the U.S. Cavalry Division. The Spanish fleet, once the Americans, together with the Cuban rebels, controlled the high ground, the Spanish fleet was no longer safe from the land-based artillery in Santiago Harbor, so they fled out to sea, where Roosevelt's world-class navy annihilated them, and that paved the way for the descent into the city of Santiago and the end of Spain's 400-year dominance of Cuba. 400 years, you think about that. That's a long time. It had been a brief war, only 37 days. Some called it a splendid little war. The Yankees and the Cubans had fought together, and for a moment, there was this feeling of brotherhood, okay? We're collaborating on making this country independent. Most of those fighting on the American side thought of it as a noble struggle for Cuba's independence from Spain, Cuba Libre. That's the second drink that to emerge from this war, Cuba Libre. And others thought it was just kind of an excuse for a global land grab, the first building block in this new American empire. In this view, the US troops in Cuba were an army of occupation, and Cuba, in the early part of the 20th century, would essentially become a US protectorate. And which was it? Was it a noble mission for Cuba Libre, or was it an imperialist land grab? My answer is it was both. It was both. But the fact is that in 1899, with the Treaty of Paris, Cuba did become a US protectorate. Their first elections occurred 2 years later, but for now, it was going to be it's essentially a US colony. An American general named Leonard Wood, who was appointed the first provisional governor of Cuba. There's a wonderful portrait in the National Portrait Gallery in Washington by John Singer Sargent. Wood was a doctor by profession, a soldier by choice. He was a friend of Teddy Roosevelt's, and he had been one of the co-founders of the Rough Riders. And Wood accomplished some good things as the new American governor. He launched a successful campaign to eliminate the yellow fever epidemic. He brought Cuban women to the US to train as teachers. And he oversaw the construction of the first part of the Malecón, which those of you who have been to Havana will know. It's sort of iconic seaside boulevard that goes across the whole city of Havana. And this marked, in 1900, the U.S. protectorate marked the beginning of a major building boom in the city. A large percentage of the city's historical buildings were built from east to west on a strip bordered by the Malecón, beginning under the governorship of Leonard Wood and continuing until late 1958, when, as we'll see, everything ground to a halt. Many of Havana's famous statues were constructed during this time, were commissioned during this time by the Americans, including the beautiful marble statues of Jose Marti in the Parque Central of Havana, and these equestrian statues that you see as you're driving along the Malecón in the city, all of them celebrating heroes of the Cuban independence. And this was kind of a sincere gesture on the part of the Americans. These statues helped give Havana the character that we still see today, and it was celebrating, heroes of the Civil War. But as with the war itself, the occupation was not entirely benevolent, and in fact was driven largely by self-interest. In 1901, Congress passed the Platt Amendment, which gave the U.S., among other things, the right to approve or disapprove of any treaties the Cuban government might want to negotiate with third nations, the right to intervene militarily on the island to protect U.S. interests if necessary, and the right to maintain naval bases essentially in perpetuity. This is the basis for Guantanamo, which still is maintained by the United States to this day. Okay, so turning back to sort of the economic side. At the early 20th century, the sugar industry had been devastated. Why? Okay, because it was completely dependent on slavery, for one thing. That's the most important thing. It was maintained by slavery. Slavery was abolished in the Spanish Empire in 1886. And even more so, it was devastated by the War of 1898, in which the Spanish forces burned many cane fields in sort of a lot of rural areas, and basically just sort of devastated the industry. And this was the way that this was sort of Cuba's main source of income. And then during the teens, what happened was you had World War I, and you had the collapse of the European sugar beet industry, and Cuba once again became a major sugar producer. Once again, they were in the position of being the primary force meeting this international addiction to sugar, and the money started to flow again. And it's really impossible to overstate how important this was sugar was for the Cuban economy. It made a lot of people very, very rich. And it was sugar that turned Havana in the late 19th and early 20th centuries into one of the wealthiest world capitals at the time, on a par with New York and Buenos Aires and London. Also, it is the reason why, one of the reasons why Havana is such an incredible place to visit today, because you still see all of these, it's like a time capsule to see all these incredibly elegant, beautiful structures built during this period. The problem with the dependence on sugar was that it was a one-crop economy. So the prices fluctuated wildly, and there were huge market crashes in 1921 and 1929. And at the same time, tourism was being recognized as an important source of income. What was going on in the United States in the 1920s? Prohibition, right? So this was the era of prohibition. So Cuba was being sold as a place to go and drink. Havana was the Paris of the Western Hemisphere. Come and visit, and the wealthy Americans in particular wanted to start coming down to gamble. You had the Astors, the DuPonts, the Harrimans, the Vanderbilts, Calvin Coolidge, and Charles Lindbergh. Anybody who was anybody at that time was going to Cuba. Some of you may have had family members who came to Cuba in the 1920s. There was plenty of fun to be had. There was horse racing, casinos, cabarets, golf, and polo. And in 1925, you had the rise of the dictator Gerardo Machado. This was a time of dropping sugar prices, so that put pressure on the social situation. He was very nationalist, protectionist. It was at the same time the rise of the Communist Party. The 1930s was, the Popular Front was a big international force. And so Machado's severe depression of this dissent led to a cycle of bombings and reprisals. Hemingway wrote about this in one of his great short story, One Trip Across. So if you want to know what Havana was like in the 1930s, that's a good story to read. So Machado forced his way into a second term and declared martial law. His focus was on extracting as much money as he could from the Cuban countryside. He created a rural police force that ended up killing a lot of farmers. Many Cubans still think of him as worse than Batista, which is saying something, especially since what we're going to hear about Batista. But he was a horrific dictator. He also had a plan, a vision of Cuba as a model city. Comparable with the great cities of Europe, truly the Paris of the Western Hemisphere. So Machado's team came up with a master plan for a major urban development project that's responsible for much of the iconic architecture you see in Cuba, especially around the Capitolio in that area. There's this neoclassical Capitolio building. This was obviously taken several years ago. Now it's gold. Now the dome is gold. And guess who donated? This is kind of a fast forward to the politics of today. Who donated the gold? The money for the gold? Any guesses? Russia. Yes, Russia. Yeah. So anyway, but this time it was. But anyway, this is modeled exactly on the U.S. Capitol, except it's 1 meter taller. Okay. He renovated the Prado Avenue. If you've been there, you probably walked on the Prado Avenue down to the Malecón. He extended the Malecón, which had been started in 1901 under Leonard Wood. And in 1930, built the $7 million luxury Hotel Nacional overlooking the Malecón, which is a major Havana landmark. And this was also a time of great prosperity, sugar-based prosperity, and a lot of the world's best examples of Art Deco architecture were built during this period. This is the Art Deco. This is the Bacardi building, which is a great example of Art Deco. So, that was built in 1930. So in 1933, there was a coup known as the Sergeants' Revolt against the nationalist coalition that had been elected to run the country. The coup was encouraged by U.S. envoy Sumner Welles and Secretary of State Cordell Hull because they were greatly concerned about what they called the Cuba situation. The U.S. saw the new Cuban government as weak. They were worried about the threat to U.S. economic interests, especially sugar interests, so they sent in warships to the waters around Havana to make sure that the coup succeeded. One of the leaders of this coup was to become a very important man in Cuban history, Fulgencio Batista, who was born in 1901 on a sugar plantation near Santiago. And I have a Cuban friend who says that Batista was promoted faster than any military man ever. The story goes that he promoted himself to colonel by taking the insignia off a dead man and putting it on his shoulder. The U.S. government saw Batista as a strong leader who was friendly to American business, so they supported him. This is an interesting picture. Can you guess who that little boy is that he's holding? No, actually Raul. That's Raul Castro. So in the late 1930s, Batista formed what would become a long relationship with the American gangster Meyer Lansky, who was known as the treasurer of the US-based mafia. Lansky introduced Batista to major mafia figures, and they formed what would effectively become a business partnership. Cuba, they encouraged the sort of Cuba to be seen as a tropical paradise filled with sensuous women, rum, rumba dancing, the Tropicana, and they wanted to promote this vision as a business proposition. Batista kind of held and lost power throughout the 40s. He was in and out of office. And then in 1952, he ran for president again, but the opposition party won the election in a landslide, and Batista couldn't accept this. So he pulled another coup d'etat and began a corrupt dictatorship that lasted until New Year's Day, or New Year's Eve and day of 1959. And they were meanwhile, in the 50s, Batista and Lansky are putting their ambitions for Havana into effect. The idea is to build the city up with hotels and casinos and to turn Havana into a huge destination for tourists like Las Vegas, sort of preceding Las Vegas and sort of but the same idea. Founded a city based on entertainment and gambling. And they controlled the prostitution and the drug trade between Cuba and the United States, with Batista, of course, getting a large piece of the action. And there was a huge construction boom, and they built their casinos and hotels. All of these, this picture could have been taken, well, almost could have been taken, recently. All those buildings are still exactly as they were, except falling down a little bit. And they built a tunnel to connect the city with the beaches to the east. Some of you who have been there might have been through that tunnel. And Havana became the destination now, instead of for elite tourists, for mass tourists from the United States. Thousands and thousands of Americans coming to see Tony Bennett at the Sans Souci and Ginger Rogers at the Copa, Nat King Cole playing the Tropicana. You had Frank Sinatra and Errol Flynn and John Wayne, and staying at regulars at the Hotel Nacional. Havana was one of the most exciting and cosmopolitan cities in the world, and also one of the most corrupt. And so this gets us to the eve of the most important event in the country's modern history, and one of the most fascinating stories of world history, the Cuban Revolution. And this is the part of the story that most of us in the United States have not heard in this particular way. But before we get to this, I want to set the scene a bit more. Cuba in the 1950s was more Americanized than any other country in the world. There was actually an undersea telecommunications cable that ran under the Straits of Florida, and a middle-class Cuban growing up in the 1950s would have memories of eating lunch at the Woolworths counter, of living in a house stocked with the latest American products. You can still, and if you go stay in a Casa Particular in Havana, you can still see the old 1950s refrigerators and stoves, and watching Gunsmoke and I Love Lucy on TV. And the streets of Cuba are still a living museum of American vintage cars from that era, most of them from the 1940s and 50s, but most of them from the 50s. But the relationship goes deeper than that. Most Cubans of a certain age almost feel like Americans themselves because of the way that they grew up. And for many, many years, they were separated. And so, especially when I first started going back in the 1990s, but even today, if they say, hey, where are you from? You say, oh, from the United States. They get a big smile on their face because they feel almost like long-lost cousins in a way. We have a lot of shared background. But there was a big downside to this relationship, too. By the 1950s, Cuba had the second highest standard of living in Latin America, second only to Venezuela, which had oil. And you can see from some of the buildings in Havana and elsewhere how opulent things were. I mean, people were living very well. But 85% of the land was controlled by Americans, most of it by big sugar companies, and almost all the rest was owned by 10 Cuban families. Government corruption was endemic, poverty was rampant, especially in the rural areas. There was high mortality, low life expectancy. 85% of the small farmers had to pay rent on the land that they tilled and lived under the constant threat of eviction. Most rural families lived in these dirt floor bohíos, these little shacks, with no access to health care, electricity, or plumbing. Meanwhile, back in Havana, the way that Batista was running things was not pretty. There was, gambling, drug trafficking, prostitution, secret police, death squads, and the nation's capital was flowing into the casinos and skyscrapers that were owned by who? By the US mafia, mostly. So the worst of Batista's policies is kind of embodied in his chief henchman, Esteban Ventura Novo, who was known as the man in the white shirt because he wore these fine English shirts. And he headed up the secret police force and was notorious for brutally torturing and assassinating the regime's political enemies, including many university students who were involved in rebel activities. It was estimated that about 20,000 opponents of the regime died during Batista's rule. So it's easy to understand why many Cubans had come to feel a deep hatred for Batista's regime. The more sadistic he got in fighting his opponents, the more popular opinion turned against him. The argument can be made that Batista's close ties to the mafia are what eventually sealed his fate and assured the victory of Fidel Castro's revolution. So let's turn to that now. This is the rise of Fidel Castro. Castro was born the illegitimate son of a wealthy farmer and Spanish-American war veteran in 1926. He went to high school in Havana, a Jesuit school called the Colegio de Belén. He was not an academic star. He dedicated himself to sport. For example, he wanted to play basketball and had never played, but he applied himself to it, and soon he was the best in the school. And a priest who was a teacher said, "Young Castro will someday have an effect on Cuban history." And you remember how we talked about this beautiful marble statue of the national hero, Jose Marti, which is in the Parque Central in Havana. Well, in 1947, a group of drunken US Marines climbed up on top of it and started to urinate. And this was an almost unbelievable insult. In the center of Havana, the statue of the country's national hero. And the Marines were confronted and driven away by a group of young University of Havana law students. One of these students was Fidel Castro. He studied to be a lawyer at the University of Havana, got involved in various revolutionary and anti-government activities, and from the beginning, there was a sense of destiny about him. He knew that he was bound for greatness, and everyone who met him was impressed with his charisma, his arrogance, his determination to win. He had a kind of world historical aura about him. July 26 of 1953, Fidel and his cohorts planned a raid on the Moncada barracks, military barracks in Santiago, and they were easily defeated. They were poorly armed. Many of them were killed. Many more were tortured to death. Batista's forces reacted badly. Batista himself told his officers that he wanted 10 attackers killed for every one of his soldiers killed, and some of the officers were real sadists. So only 6 of the attackers were killed in the fighting, but there were 58 casualties in the end. So go figure. Most of the rebels were tortured and executed. Fidel Castro and several others were captured and put in jail. Now you might, and then eventually released on amnesty in 1955. So you might ask, well, how come some of these people were captured instead of tortured, and how could Batista release them? Why would he release them in 1955? But you remember that picture that we saw of Batista holding Raul Castro. They were aristocratic families. They were part of the Cuban elite. So their families had a lot of power and were putting pressure on Batista to release these misled young children. And the fact is that Batista wanted to be elected legitimately. He had taken power, but in coup d'etat, he wanted a legitimate election to sort of put the stamp of approval on his power. So he thought, and Fidel Castro was a popular figure, so basically they got released, and they immediately, Fidel and several others, immediately went over to Mexico City and started training and recruiting for the revolution. They named themselves the Movimiento 26 de Julio, the 26th of July movement. This was the date of the Moncada, the failed Moncada attack. And in Mexico, he met an Argentine doctor and self-proclaimed leprosy expert, Ernesto Guevara de la Serna, Che Guevara, who had been asthmatic as a youngster. He grew up in Buenos Aires, reading a lot, playing a lot of chess, but he was impatient to test his physical boundaries, and he became quite an adventurer, climbing mountains, setting off on these long bicycle trips. You may have seen, and motorcycle trips, you may have seen the motorcycle, or read the motorcycle diaries, volunteering in leper colonies, and developing a deep sympathy for the poor and downtrodden, and decided to dedicate his life to revolutionary struggle. In Mexico, Che saw what a lot of others had seen. He recognized Fidel's special, absolute belief in himself, determination to win, his special kind of charisma, and he thought, well, this crazy scheme of starting a revolution in Cuba just might succeed. And so in late November of 1956, the revolutionaries bought a yacht from an American who had named it, an American who couldn't spell very well, who had named it after his grandmother, called the Granma, which you can still see on display in Havana at the Museum of the Revolution. 82 people aboard this yacht, okay? Back in Cuba, they had some support. There were two people in particular, Frank Pais and Celia Sanchez. Frank Pais was head of the clandestine part of the movement. His job was to organize an uprising in Santiago to coincide with the landing of this boat, to give a distraction so that the revolutionaries could go melt into the mountains. And Celia Sanchez was a very interesting person. She was the daughter of a prominent doctor in Pilon, a small town southwest of Santiago, near where the Granma was planning to land. And she was going to become a key figure in the revolution as well. Her job was to sort of help get the revolutionaries off the boat and up into the mountains. The problem is that a storm caught them, and they were delayed by 2 days. And so the uprising was in Santiago did happen. It was quickly put down, but it didn't really do anything except alert Batista's forces to the fact that something was afoot. And then on the way in at night, the lookout fell overboard, and they had to circle back and turn on their spotlight to find him, and therefore they were spotted by a Cuban Coast Guard vessel. So Batista was alerted to the fact that this boat was landing. So they landed on December 2nd of 1956 near Santiago, and then 3 days later, on December 5th, they were resting by a sugarcane field, and they were surprised. They were ambushed and bombed. They had planes coming in, and most of those, so the troops and the planes, most of these original 82 were killed, caught, or tortured. Only 21 survivors escaped. By December 21st, 1956, these stragglers had rendezvoused at the farmhouse that Celia Sanchez had arranged for them in the foothills of the Sierra Maestra Mountains, and this was the core of the rebel army. They were 16 fighters, and they only had 7 weapons. This was going to form the nucleus of the army that was going to come down out of the mountains to take over the country. It's a crazy story, right? So among their survivors were Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, and Camilo Cienfuegos, and Raul Castro, of course. But it was Fidel, Che, and Camilo who would become the kind of famous bearded trinity that would become the sort of mythical faces of the revolution. In the next 2 years, Fidel, Che, Camilo, Paul, Raul, Celia, and the cohort built a tough and resourceful small guerrilla army. And again, Celia Sanchez had a key role. She was coordinating logistical support. She was living clandestinely. She was helping them, but undercover. Like nobody knew that she was doing this. So she was coordinating this logistical support. And by the way, there's a book called One Day in December, if you're interested in Celia Sanchez, a really great biography of her. And it's just the life that she led as kind of, helping the revolutionaries. It was really dangerous. It was very tense. It's a good story. But she was organizing the weapons, sending new recruits up into the mountains, and she developed a reputation for being extremely tough and cool-headed. And one of the things that she coordinated in 1957 was a visit to the mountains of a New York Times reporter named Herbert Matthews, who wanted to interview Fidel. Fidel wanted to do the interview. Batista's allies had been spreading the rumor that he'd been killed back in that cane field after the Granma landing. And so in his Times article, which you can still read online, Matthew confirmed that Fidel was alive and goes on to describe him as irresistibly charismatic. He wrote, "The personality of the man is overwhelming. He is a great talker. His brown eyes flash. His intense face is pushed close to the listener, and a whispering voice, as in a stage play, lends a vivid sense of drama. And the Times article was a huge success for the rebels, one of a string of remarkable successes that seem almost impossible or unbelievable in retrospect. They were very clever, okay? They constantly exaggerated their numbers to make themselves seem like a more formidable force. For example, during Matthew's visit, they had prearranged to have one of the fighters hide in the bushes and come out during the interview saying, "Comandante, Comandante, I come bearing a message from the second column." Second column, I mean, the fighters at that time still numbered in the 20s, right? But they had a second column, so Herbert Matthews is writing this down, you know. They would do things like, they had a radio with loudspeakers, and they would record a quintet of musicians playing as they fought, but they recorded gunfire, and then they broadcast this on loudspeakers with the gunfire, and then added their own gunfire, so it made it seem like there was this overwhelming force in the mountains. And at the same time, they were good at propaganda. They formed a thing called Radio Rebelde. The idea of Radio Rebelde was to sort of report on the revolution, and it was to basically sort of gain credence or gain support in the country and internationally. So they were doing that, but they also locally, the people, these little villages in the Sierra Maestra, they had a number of doctors. So Che Guevara was not the only doctor among them, but whenever they came to one of these villages, they would have everybody come out and they'd give them free medical care. So this is, people would associate the revolution with free medical care. This is a photograph of Raul Castro doing some outreach, you know, in the downtime between the battles. So meanwhile, Celia was trickling, you know, was coordinating the trickle of volunteers, which soon became more of a flow because you had Radio Rebelde kind of doing the propaganda. You had Celia sort of organizing volunteers, recruits to go up into the mountains. And so they knew that it was through public relations that this war was going to be won. On March 13th of 1957, a group of militants allied to the rebels in the mountains made an unsuccessful assassination attempt at the presidential palace in Havana against Batista. If you go there, you may have been to the Museo de la Revolución, which is in this building. You can still see those bullet holes in the marble staircase. But they failed. They were all killed. There's a truck at the Museum of the Revolution that's full of bullet holes. But the success of that was that they let everybody know that it's not just this small group of rebels in the mountains. They also have allies in the city. In May of 1957, they had their first outright victory in the Sierra Maestra range. This was the first military engagement, by the way, in which Celia Sanchez carried a rifle and used it. She actually fought. And it's interesting to note, as a side note, that the crucial role that women played in the Cuban Revolution, which is pretty striking if you think about it. There were actually 2 all-woman brigades by the time they came down out of the mountains. This was the late 1950s, in a culture sort of broadly, at least known to us in the Anglo world as, you know, for its machismo, right? But there have always been strong women in Spanish-speaking cultures, and that was certainly true in the Cuban Revolution, so it makes a lot of sense. In February of 1958, Raul Castro opened a new front in the Sierra de Cristal, one of those mountain ranges on the eastern part of the island, and now the rebels controlled the entire eastern sector of Cuba, and they had widespread support across the country, and they began to advance to the west. By August 1958, they were ready to come streaming down out of the mountains. In December 29th of 1958, forces led by Che Guevara took the key strategic city of Santa Clara and blew up this train, which was full of, they sort of derailed this train, which was full of troops, and captured all these troops. This was a huge victory, and with Santa Clara taken, the rebel army's advance into Havana was clear, and Batista saw the writing on the wall. New Year's Eve, 1958, he fled the country in his private plane. He went to the Dominican Republic, then to Spain, where he lived in great luxury for the rest of his life. His chief police, secret police guy, Esteban Ventura Novo, also fled the country. He ended up in Miami, where he founded a security firm and lived until his death in 2001. The next day, January 1st, New Year's Day, 1959, the rebel army headed by Che Guevara and Camilo Cienfuegos rides triumphantly into Havana, and remember what we said about the importance of gambling and the fact that one of the things that assured Batista's destruction was the fact that the mafia was really in control. One of the first things, so the newly liberated citizens of Havana did two things. One, they raided the casinos and destroyed all the gambling equipment. And the second thing is they destroyed all the parking meters. So Fidel Castro joined them on January 7th, and days of triumphant celebration followed. You have these great pictures taken at the time. These are very sort of atmospheric pictures. There was basically not a shot was fired in Havana. Havana was not really affected by the war, which is another reason that it's still, it's still such a great time capsule. But they were very clever at manipulating imagery. So while Fidel Castro was speaking in this one instance, a white dove landed on his shoulder. 70% of the population in Cuba practices Afro-Caribbean religions, Santeria, we call it, but and what does that mean? What does a white dove mean in Santeria? It means that Fidel is being sort of sanctioned and blessed by the Orishas. So it's a very, very brilliant idea to do this. So from January to April 1959, around 1,000 people who were accused of being war criminals and or associated with Batista's secret police were put on public trial, and of those, 550 were executed. Most of these executions took place at La Cabana Fortress, which is where I mentioned the Cañonazo every night. That's where that takes place. I have spoken to anti-Castro exiles who say the number is much higher, but there's no evidence of that. In May of 1959, a Cuban land reform law was passed that authorized the seizure of U.S. citizens' properties for redistribution to the rural poor. And this began a month later and was devastating to U.S. sugar interests. Many wealthy Cubans left the country at this point, and once they left, the government took over their property. Many Cubans in Havana live in apartments carved out of these subdivided mansions. The rule was that anyone you can stay, you don't have to leave, anybody who stays, but if you have 6 houses, you have to give up all but one. You can only keep one house. So there was a lot of property coming into the hands of the government. The official Soviet news agents and trade officials arrived in December of 1959, and in February of 1960, a high-level Soviet diplomat toured Cuba. You have to remember what the mindset of the United States was at that time. And we were in the midst of the space race, the arms race. This was the height of the Cold War. Sputnik and all that. It was just the height of the Cold War. And so this was not a good look from the United States perspective. And so in 1960, most economic ties between Cuba and the United States were severed, and Cuba and the United States broke diplomatic relations with Cuba in January of 1961, and they were not restored until 2012 under Obama. But think about this from the Cuban perspective. The government was giving out land, it was giving out free education, housing, healthcare. They were sending teachers and doctors into rural areas, often for the first time ever. They instituted this system of food distribution called the Libreta de Abastecimiento, which you can still see in Havana. These little neighborhood shops that basically take care of your staples. So even in economic hard times, of which there have been many in Cuba, nobody goes hungry. You can get your staples. So regardless of your thoughts about the economic sustainability of this kind of model, you have to admit that it was highly effective politically. Because why would any poor Cuban be against this kind of government that's going to do this? And so I won't go into too much detail of the Bay of Pigs, but just let me make a few points about it. First of all, the term Bay of Pigs may be based on a mistaken translation. Cochinos in Spanish does mean pigs, but in Old Spanish it also means triggerfish. And so, the Bay of Pigs is a wonderful place for snorkeling. It's a beautiful ecosystem. It's actually adjacent to one of the largest protected mangrove areas in the entire Caribbean basin. And one of the things you see there is a lot of these queen triggerfish. So it should maybe be called the Bay of Triggerfish instead of the Bay of Pigs. It doesn't really have the same ring. The idea of the invasion was it was going to be sort of the reverse of Fidel's revolution. The idea you would land these fighters, they would disappear into the mountains, and then the people would rise up, of course, against this new communist regime. They would retake their own country, and so this was the idea of the people who sort of started, who planned and initiated the Bay of Pigs. For this to work, they needed plausible deniability. They needed it to seem like an internal uprising, not something that was orchestrated from the United States. So you can see, like on their boats, the lack of markings. They also, this is the reason that they trained the force that was going to do the invasion, trained in Florida, but went down and started it actually came from, Honduras, Nicaragua, out down here, to make it look like it was not a U.S. operation. But there was a problem with this line of thinking, because the idea is if you're going to do a reverse Cuban Revolution, you're going to need to have people who are really chafing to get rid of the revolution. But as I just said, most people, especially in rural areas, or at that point, most of the country was pretty much behind the revolution. So who's going to rise up against a popular government, right? And so could people really be counted up to rise up against it? Anyway, there was a couple of planes that were painted with Cuban Air Force insignia in Miami, and then flown down and bombed some airports and stuff like that. And that tipped Fidel Castro off that something was going on. There were only a few places on the coast that they could land. Bay of Pigs was one of them. It's one of the few places that has a sort of landing beach instead of coral rock. So he reacted quickly and took personal command of the effort to repel the invasion. And in short order, the Cuban forces destroyed the invasion's command and control vessel and quickly gained air dominance, shooting down most of the American support planes. You can see the remains of these planes at the museum in Bay of Pigs. And the invasion was a major rout. In less than 72 hours, Castro's forces surround the attackers, and some began to surrender while others fled into the hills. 114 of the invaders were killed, and around 1,200 were captured. And the Bay of Pigs provided a huge rallying point for the revolutionary government. It was seen as an underdog's victory. Okay, this great empire to the north tries to do this invasion, and we defeat it. We have the power to do this. So it was a great rallying point. Even up until a couple of years ago, you'd still see billboards celebrating the routing of the imperialists in the Bay of Pigs. But I want to think, it makes sense if you. So I'm a writer, so I look at things from the perspective of narrative. But if you step back for a moment and think about the story that we just told, a small group of young men and women take over the country from a corrupt dictator against all odds. So very improbable, very brilliantly done. They figure out how to do it. The small force in the mountains. Then they go off later to fight off an invasion from the largest, most powerful nation on earth. And then they go on fighting off this larger nation to the north for more than 5 decades. So it's a classic underdog story, and it's easy to understand why it would strike a kind of lasting note of pride in a country that has, for most of its history, been dominated by foreign empires. First it was the Spanish, then it was the Americans, and then it was the Soviets, right? So I think this is essential background information that most Americans don't really fully understand about Cuba. For many Cubans, particularly the older generation, the men and women who launched the Cuban Revolution are part of an emotionally resonant national mythology. So whatever their current opinions about the revolution, Che, Fidel, Raul, Camilo, Celia, and other revolutionary leaders are seen as founders of the country, sort of like 1960s Cuban versions of Paul Revere or George Washington, And of course, Che became a martyr and an international icon. He was killed by gunfire in Bolivia in 1967, and Celia Sanchez died of lung cancer in the 1970s. but she, before she died, she created the thing called the Copelia, which if you've been to Havana, the Copelia is like this huge ice cream stand, or the series of ice cream stands, and it gives basically, free, subsidized ice cream, really good ice cream to Cuba, so she's kind of a hero for that. On one of my first trips to Cuba, I met a beautiful waitress who was also a neurosurgeon. You have a lot, this is kind of one of those paradoxes that you see a lot in Cuba. She's a neurosurgeon, she's making money being a waitress. She was also a poet, and when I asked her what kind of poetry she wrote, she said, oh, mostly poems dedicated to Comandante Che. Right. So, and I think that Fidel Castro is even more interesting as a historical figure. After leading the revolution, he foiled hundreds of assassination attempts, including poisoned cigars and exploding seashells, and outlasted 10 US presidents. So whether you think he was an evil totalitarian and one of the worst dictators of the 20th century, which is what many Cuban exiles believe, or whether you see him as a kind of mildly autocratic leader who did not tolerate criticism well, but did forge a lasting values-based society of dignity and equity and universal health care, education, great cultural richness, which is the view that many people that I know still live on the island have, despite the fact that they're in such difficult times. Whatever your opinion, there's no question that he was one of the major world historical figures of the 20th century. So I just want to say a few words about Cuba today. This has been history so far, and I want to I'll talk a little bit more about history, but talk a little bit more about the period. There's a thing called the special period, the so-called special period, which happened in 1989, 1990, when the Soviet Empire collapsed and the Eastern Bloc countries collapsed. When the Soviet subsidies were withdrawn, they had been buying Cuban sugar at inflated prices and really sort of floating the entire Cuban economy. When that was pulled out from under Cuba, Cuba went into a major economic depression. In fact, it was a depression or contraction in the Cuban economy 3 times as severe as the Great Depression in the United States. So it was very, very difficult period. Blackouts, brownouts, very severe privation, shortages of food. Most people were having trouble getting meat. They still had enough to eat. Basic rations. I first came to the island sort of at the end of this period in 1999. Many people were, I'd ride the elevator with someone, they'd be like, hey, how are you doing? I'm okay, but my stomach kind of hurts because I haven't had meat in a week, or something like that. So on one trip, my wife observed that Cuba sort of reminded her of a post-apocalyptic society, but one that made you feel a little optimistic because the world, in a sense, had ended, but everyone, instead of it being like you see these, you read these post-apocalyptic novels or movies about cannibalism and everybody attacking each other and roving gangs, everybody in Cuba kind of came together, and it became, sort of this community response. They had to make everything work. Cubans, for this reason, are the best mechanics in the world. They can fix a car with a piece of gum. There still are these shops, and they have a sort of a metal table like this. If you have a broken radio or something, you bring it in, and they have an engineer standing there, and they'll fix it right as you watch. So very creative, innovative. The ability to sort of make do, create, innovate, and this is how they've kept the old cars going. And now every time I take a trip to Cuba, it feels like a freeze frame in a time-lapse photo sequence, illuminating a particular moment on a long, slow timeline of change. In around 2012, the process looked like it was going to be accelerating. 2 factors. One was the easing of private sector restrictions that was initiated by Raul Castro's government in 2012 and 2013, giving out new business licenses, encouraging new entrepreneurs, and the growth, especially in the country's dynamic tourism sector that I referred to at the beginning, that resulted in the loosening of under Obama, the loosening of travel rules for U.S. citizens, and in 2014 everything was loosened up, and so. During this time, tourism kind of exploded in Cuba. You'd see, Americans everywhere, and you'd hear Brooklyn accents, and you'd see there's a lot of Europeans as well. So many of these new entrepreneurs were just sort of like, this is great. They started a restaurant, and they've got all kinds of clients, and it was this sort of optimistic time of flourishing. Ironically, it was capitalism. This was sort of capitalism coming to Cuba in a great way. These young, new entrepreneurs. And so, watching it at the time, you might have felt optimistic. I did. I felt like, okay, this seems like things are kind of headed in the right direction. It seemed like Cuba might finally be figuring out a way to become prosperous. The idea was that, many at the time were talking about how it could be a Vietnam-style transition to capitalism, one that allowed for increasing economic prosperity while still holding on to the great achievements of the revolution in education, in healthcare, in culture, in the arts. But unfortunately, that's not what happened. Under the first Trump administration, travel to Cuba was deliberately choked off, then COVID hit. And things in Cuba, unfortunately, started to go backwards, so that the economic conditions are now worse than they have been since the 1990s. It's almost like being back in the special period. And we can talk about that now in addition to ideas for possible future solutions. But I want to end sort of with a quote from my favorite Cuban novelist, Leonardo Padura. He says, "Cuba is trapped between two eternally competing visions. One is that it's a socialist paradise. The other is that it's a communist hell. In reality, Cuba is neither a paradise nor a hell, but rather more of a purgatory where some of us have the possibility for salvation." And so just think about for a moment about the story we just told. So 400 years under the Spanish Empire, long time, 4 centuries. And after the Spanish, it was the Americans that were in control. Americans sort of dominated from the end of the 1898 war all the way to the end of Batista's regime in 1958. And so finally, and then the Soviets came in, right? So then it was the Soviet Empire. So it was just one empire after another. And then finally, almost for the first time in its history, in around 2012 or so, Cuba saw a chance to stand on its own as a sovereign, independent country without being controlled by a great empire. And that sovereignty still exists. The question is, will they be able to take advantage of it? And will we let them? Will the United States let them become a successful, sovereign country? So I'll just end there and throw it open for questions, discussion. The other thing I'll say is that if anybody is interested in going to Cuba or in staying abreast of Cuba stuff, I have a card on the table. If you fill out the back, you can either take the card, or if you fill out the back of the card with your email address, I can put you on my mailing list, which is very infrequent, but it has things about travel programs in addition to my writing news and stuff like that. So, questions, thoughts, etc. Yeah.
So I was just in Cuba January 25th to February 3rd of this year.
Yeah.
And 2 questions that I walked away with. I was struck living in Burlington or anywhere in the United States of homelessness. And I tried to find out why I was not seeing any homelessness in Havana.
Yeah.
And the answer by a Cuban was that housing is passed on within families. And so there is not that sort of homelessness.
Yeah.
The second question is, I feel that, with not paying doctors, professionals very much, and in fact, somebody that I met on a pension right now as a former academic is barely making it, that they've tried to equalize. But when I was on the plane coming from Miami, a young man said, but the people next to the government do quite well. And the rest of Cubans are sort of limping along. And then there was all this discrepancy of people who are in the tourist business who seem to have access to things other people are not.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, good for you for going to Cuba. That is the most helpful thing you can do. Just going was an act of care, so thank you for going. Secondly, I think the fact that you came back with questions is typical of people who go to Cuba. You leave with more questions than you come with. That's one of the reasons I keep going back, because it's so interesting. It's not a transparent country. It's not easy to figure out, and it's like a big puzzle. So in that spirit, your question about homelessness, the response that I hear most frequently from Cubans is that, well, we don't have homelessness because it's illegal. It is illegal to have homelessness. Everybody has to have lodging. You can't have homeless people on the street. So it doesn't happen. Does everybody live in the most beautiful circumstances? No. But everybody is supposed to have a roof over their heads, and that's sort of borne out by my experience of many years going there, is you just don't see homelessness to the same extent that you would see in Burlington or San Francisco or anywhere. And then about the second part of the question, the idea of salaries, inequality of income, yeah, those are real questions. I mean, you have a country where you have 98% literacy, one of the most educated populations on the planet, and well-educated. You'll take a taxi ride and the guy has a PhD in architecture, and you have the most interesting conversations. And again, you have neurosurgeons who are waiting tables. Yes, and people who are in the tourism. So one of my good friends who sort of is a guide for me when I send families down there is a professor of constitutional law, but makes much more money guiding tourists from tips. That's a paradox, and it's not something that is great. And so do people associated with the government do better? I'm sure they probably do. Again, it's not transparent, so it's hard to know. But yes, there are rumors, and I'm sure that is the case. But is it the kind of society where you see radical inequalities of income on display? No, you don't see that, and certainly not to the degree that we have here in the United States. Like in the United States, the inequality of income that we're experiencing now is more severe than it has been since the Gilded Age, right? Which is pretty insane. That's not the case in Cuba. But yes, there are inequalities, and so the thing I think that made so many people so optimistic back in 2012 was sort of like, okay, now it's true that people associated with tourism do better. That's why everybody wants to get involved with tourism. But in 2000, under Obama, it looked like that was going to be sort of spread. The idea was to sort of, one of the reasons that Raul Castro gave out all these business licenses was because they wanted to spread the wealth of tourism a little bit and make sure that it wasn't coming to just point, these one points and concentrating. So giving lots of people, small entrepreneurs, the chance to benefit. And so that was a source of optimism back then. But again, once the Trump restrictions went in place in 2016, and even more so with COVID, those young businesses, most of them have gone out of business. Those optimistic young capitalists are, many of them have already left. They're, traveling up through Mexico to the United States or going to Madrid or whatever. And but the businesses are still there, but the businesses that are there are more like the businesses that were there before. The new businesses, most of them didn't survive. So I don't have an easy answer. It's difficult. Yeah.
Yeah, I was in Cuba over 20 years ago, so hey, thanks, Kathy. But I'm wondering about some agricultural stuff. How much of the island's food are they able to produce now, and where is the rest of it coming from?
Yeah.
And what about tobacco? How much tobacco is being exported?
So agriculture is a really interesting thing in Cuba because on one hand, I'll talk about the negative first, and that is that I think about 70% of their food has to be imported, which is tough because it's an island of around 11 million people. And they have a lot of potentially arable land, right? So the reforms are sort of needed in that sphere, and it's difficult. They import a lot of the rice. They import actually eggs and chicken, mostly come from the United States, ironically, because we have it, But on the plus side about agriculture, they out of necessity developed some of the best sort of technologies for organic agriculture. The technologies, by technology I mean some methodologies, because they had to. Because they, in the special period, they no longer had any access to petroleum-based fertilizers, petroleum-based pesticides, and so they had to do it all. So they created. It's wonderful to go to an organic farm in Cuba because you can see many of them have like a little insect cage where they breed their own kind of predator insects. And then the way that they plant things, like they'll have a marigold at the end of every row, whatever, the sort of natural pesticides that they developed, and composting, and the organic food that you can get is amazing. A lot of the produce, it's gotten better and better. So they're making some progress. But yeah, it's difficult. They have to figure that out, the fact that they're importing so much food. Yes?
I was in Havana, and I just wanted to share two images that have really stuck with me. I always do that. There were these dilapidated, sooty-covered buildings with the whitest laundry ever I have seen hanging out on the lines. I don't know how they did it. And the second one was that there were a lot of cats and dogs running around. And I worried about them, and I talked to one woman, and she said, oh, they're fed. And I also noticed that a lot of them had ribbons around their necks, and that meant that they had been spayed or neutered.
Yeah, that's true. And the pet situation, there are programs in Havana especially that go around sort of immunizing and spaying pets. And in general, I think even outside of Havana and in neighborhoods where that doesn't happen, the animals are well cared for. And I think it's kind of symptomatic of a sense of community on the island. Why is that? Well, I don't know exactly, but part of it is cultural, but part of it also is that the neighborhoods are really kind of cohesive, and the country is organized by neighborhood. Every neighborhood has a thing called the, oh God, I can't remember what it's called. But anyway, every neighborhood has an association, right? And so there's a president of the association. And it goes along with the idea that other people have observed, well, the crime is extremely low in Cuba. The crime rate, especially for violent crime, is very, very low. You can go anywhere, you feel safe. Why is that? Well, it's because effectively every neighborhood has their own neighborhood watch group. It's an organization where people are looking at, it was originally organized as a sort of way to detect counter-revolution and stuff like that, but it has evolved into this incredible tool so that if you want to immunize people, you don't go, have the government start knocking on doors. You go to the president of the local association and you say, hey, can you get everybody to show up at a certain time to get immunized? Everybody, if you see someone in the neighborhood who's looking like they're going to do some crime, you let the president know, and the president lets. And and also, you have a culture where, partially because of the housing thing we were talking about, you have 3, even 4 generations all living together, and so it is a real sense. There's a real sense of community and sort of looking out for the people. And I think people's identity is tied to their neighborhood, so it's interesting. The other thing, there are lots of pluses, but again, we have to listen to that Padura quote. It's not a socialist heaven, but there are things that are really good, like the crime rates and the fact that just care for older people is evident everywhere. People are very caring for, and they respect their elders, and there's no homelessness. So there's a lot of things like that you can notice that are actually really inspiring. As an artist myself, I'm a writer. I'm inspired by what Cubans have done with the arts. You probably saw it's an incredible, the discipline, the work that they put in every single day to get good at what they do. Musicians, dancers, whatever. Even just street sweepers. Everybody takes pride in their work, and again, it's this highly educated population. So it's a population that seems, if U.S. policy were at all rational, which it's not, but if it were, you have this 11 million population island, 89 miles from our shores, where people are 98% literate, incredibly talented, incredibly hardworking. So what's the problem? I don't know. Other questions? Yes.
So given that, I'm wondering about what is the sense of the state of the Cuban Revolution today?
Yeah.
Because they have a new president.
Yes.
And so I'm curious about kind of what the feeling is of people on the island, given the change from the Castros to the Miguel Diaz-Canel, and as well as the influx of kind of global forces like tourism and that possible opening up from Obama. Was there a sense that they might have lost something of the revolution by kind of opening up to globalization? And because it is the reason why it's been able to retain a lot of its history is because it had remained kind of cohesive and closed off because of the embargo. At the same time, the embargo is the reason that many of them are, that they suffer from what we would call a lower standard of living today.
Yeah, so what's the state of the revolution? Well, I actually had a chance to meet Diaz-Canel one time, before he became president. He's very tall. I don't think he's very popular right now, unfortunately. I think that people are feeling, I think, so part of your question was, well, if this opening had succeeded, with Obama, and if they had continued on that trajectory, would they have been able to hold on to the achievements of the revolution? And I knew a lot of people who were optimistic that they would, but there were other people, especially in sort of middle ranks of the government, who were not optimistic, who were really against what Obama and Raul were doing and wanted to shut that down because they felt that it wasn't, that it would put in danger the achievements of the revolution. But most people I knew were kind of optimistic because, and I was kind of optimistic too, because I feel like the achievements of the revolution are kind of ingrained. Like the educational system, the healthcare system, the fact that it is organized on a neighborhood basis. I mean, there's a theory like, oh, well, you open it up to capitalism, you're going to start seeing McDonald's on every corner. You can't. There's the laws about foreign ownership. Like you can't, if you're a foreign business, you cannot purchase property in Cuba. You can't. The government has a rule where the government ownership has to be at least 51% of any sort of joint venture. So that there are controls, and the idea of a slow, well, most Cubans that I talked to were like slowly, incrementally changing, allowing people to have more economic opportunity, which is necessary. They need it. Their standard of living is lower, and there's desperation, especially once you get outside of Havana. It needs to change, But most Cubans that I know, or many that I talked to, were sort of like, yeah, so let's try and do a slow change, kind of like the Vietnam model, so that we can really, have a sustainable economy, but still hold on to the good things that we have. At least it would never be perfect, but in some way. But that's not where we are now. Where we are now is a population that's increasingly desperate. Diaz-Canel is increasingly unpopular. The revolution, people still look on the revolution in the way that I described. I think older people in particular taking pride in the fact that it's a revolution that was able to defy the superpower to the north for so long. But the longer time goes on and the more desperate things become, people are leaving. There's huge brain drain. There's migration to the United States and elsewhere. And the situation is really desperate. And so something needs to change. And I would say it would be really good to get back to the kind of policies that we had under Obama with regard to Cuba, because we're the neighbor. We're in many ways responsible for what's going on in Cuba. We should be doing what we can to kind of help and to do it in a constructive way. But then there are a lot of people, as you know, and who want to, I'm sure there are plenty of people who would just love to go in and just take over. They figure if you get rid of the revolutionary government, then everything would become, would be fine. But I think what most Cubans are really afraid of is like what happened in Russia, where you have a vacuum, you have sudden changes, you have violence, you have a vacuum of power, and you have an oligarchy that rises up or comes back in from where they are now, which is Miami. And that could be really ugly. So I think I think incrementalism is Cuban's friend, but we need to get back to a trajectory of positive incrementalism. How's that going to happen? I don't know.
We should probably stop, but thank you so much.
Thank you.
This was a great
Thank you.